Today I'm joined by Dr. Jeremy DeSilva. He is a paleoanthropologist and a professor of anthropology at Dartmouth University, where he specializes in the locomotion of our early hominin ancestors. And he's also the author of the book, First Steps, How Walking Upright Made Us Human. Jeremy, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. So, Jeremy, how did you first get interested in anthropology?
Well, so I never took a biological anthropology course in college. That was not my path. Most anthropologists were exposed to anthropology in college, and I just wasn't. I was always interested in science. I went to undergrad thinking I was going to go into astronomy. I was really interested in the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, and then I got destroyed by the math. Actually, the math took me out.
You were a physics major?
I was astrophysics major, and then I really started struggling my second, third year, and I reluctantly switched over to animal physiology and biology, thinking I might want to go into go to vet school or go into biotech or something like that. This was the late 90s when biotech was really surging. And I didn't like that either. I mean, I liked it. I just didn't have, I just wasn't passionate about it. And after college, I started working at the Boston Museum of Science as an educator, and I fell in love with teaching. And one day my boss approached me about updating our human evolution exhibit. There had been all these new fossil discoveries in the late 90s and early 2000s, and we were still presenting human evolution in sort of a linear fashion. It turns out that the fossil record was showing much more diversity and much more of a mosaic evolution of our different unique features. And we wanted to sort of change how we taught about that. And really emphasize how new discoveries force you to rethink old ideas in science. That we saw this as a really good lens through which to teach the whole nature of science. So I started doing some research on paleoanthropology, and I got hooked. I absolutely fell in love with these fossils and all the things these fossils can tell us about the past and about what our ancestors were like, in their individual lives, but then of course the big picture pace and tempo of changes that happen through time. I was hooked, and so that's how I discovered anthropology, was as an educator at the Science Museum. And then
wow.
I went to grad school for at that point.
So was tying in locomotion, is that a way you were able to bring in your physics background?
That's funny. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah. I mean, definitely sort of the mechanics and simple mechanics that you learn about in college, lever mechanics, applies very much to the skeleton and to muscle attachments and providing leverage and trade-offs between speed and power and all those things that you can learn about in a physics classroom apply very much to the biomechanics of primates and to the mechanics of walking. So it's funny, Adam, I hadn't really thought about that connection before, but you're probably right, that I probably saw the skeleton as a simple machine, in a way that that reminded me of that, the classroom, my freshman, sophomore year. Even though those weren't the best experiences for me because I was struggling so mightily. I still, that's how my mind works. And so I like that connection. Yeah.
Right. So going back to this non-linearity of evolution, I feel like a lot of us non-anthropologists might have a picture of, like, way back we were basically chimps, and then gradually we start standing up straighter and being less hairy and growing bigger brains. So that's kind of the linear path, I guess. But well, that's wrong. I mean, I think one of the most shocking discoveries for me was that we became bipedal before we started using our hands for tools. I think a lot of people assume that you start using your hands and then suddenly you have to walk upright, but it was the other way around.
It appears that way. we have evidence for upright walking, and this comes from the shapes of bones of fossils that we find going back 5, 6, 7 million years, right to when we shared a common ancestor with the ancestors of chimpanzees. And that evidence for upright locomotion long precedes the first evidence for stone tool technology, which is about 3.3 million years old. And that's a debated site. And so certainly by 2.6 million years, there's firm evidence for stone tool use. And so you have millions of years of our ancestors moving around on two legs and not making stone tools. Now, they may have been making tools out of perishable items that don't preserve in the archaeological record. So that's a possibility of the absence of this archaeological evidence, maybe just a taphonomic bias, a bias against preservation of leafy or stick materials or something like that. But we've got millions of years we're dealing with here. I think you're right that the way to interpret the data we currently have is that bipedalism long precedes technological ingenuity in our ancestors. But yeah, that image that a lot of your listeners probably have of the chimpanzee slowly turning into the human, right? We see it on coffee cups and bumper stickers and t-shirts, and look, it's a hypothesis, right? Did we evolve in a slow linear fashion from a knuckle walking ape? And you test that with fossils, and the fossil record is getting better and better and better and better. We keep finding new things that show that the story was not that. And there are three ways in which it was not that I'll tell you briefly. That first off, it wasn't one species at a time. There were lots of different species coexisting. So it was more like a bushy tree rather than that simple linear progression. The second thing is that each way in which we're different from a chimpanzee didn't evolve in concert. So you didn't have bipedalism slowly changing as brains slowly changed, as hairlessness slowly happens. Instead, those things were happening in again, a mosaic fashion, where upright walking seems to happen long before brain enlargement, or even the evolution of quote unquote hairlessness. We're not hairless, but less than a chimp. And the third way, which I think you were alluding to, is that these early members of our lineage that we expected to look more and more chimpanzee-like, they're not. They're still looking like they're upright. And so one of the hypotheses that we're now contending with in our science and trying to test is this idea that uprightness was one of these sort of original forms of these early apes, and that knuckle walking happened later in chimpanzees and in gorillas. And that we almost have this story of chimps, turning into humans. We kind of have it reversed in a way when it comes to locomotion. That uprightness may have been something that long preceded even knuckle walking. We're still trying to figure that one out. The field is pretty divided on that, and we need a lot more fossils to know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to unpack that further. So before we do that, when we're talking about these dates and when we're throwing around like huge terms like millions of years ago, how do you arrive at those numbers? I've heard of carbon dating, but I don't know much about it. I don't know if that's what you do. So it would be great to talk about that.
Sure, and carbon dating is a good entry point for it, because a lot of people have heard of carbon dating. And so there's a radioactive isotope of carbon called carbon-14, and it doesn't want to be carbon-14, and it slowly decays into nitrogen. And so over time, carbon-14 will decay, and that time is something called a half-life. And so if you have a bone, and that individual over the course of its life had been eating and drinking and breathing, and it would have incorporated carbon into its tissues, some of that carbon would be carbon-14, and it would slowly decay into what we call its daughter element. And we know the rate, physicists and chemists have worked on this, and we know the rate at which it happens, and it's about 5,000 years. So every 5,000 years, half of the carbon in the material goes away. And then another 5,000 years, another half. So now you're down to a quarter. And then in another 5,000 years, it's another half. So now you're down to an eighth. Well, pretty soon you run out of this stuff. And it takes about 50,000 years to run out of carbon-14. So we can carbon date things that are about as old as 50,000 years. So some Neanderthal fossils can be dated this way. early Homo sapiens, later Homo sapien fossils can be dated this way. But the fossils that are in the millions of years need to be dated with a material that decays more slowly than carbon does. Carbon goes away too fast. And so researchers work with radioactive potassium, which is released during volcanic eruptions, and it decays into argon at a known rate, a lot slower than carbon. So what we do is we find a fossil and it's wedged between a couple of layers of volcanic ash, especially in Eastern Africa, which is very tectonically active. Lots of volcanoes over time have been putting down layers of ash. And so if you find a fossil wedged between two layers of volcanic ash, you can date those layers from the ratio of radioactive potassium to argon, and then the fossil in between those layers has to be between those dates. So the famous Lucy skeleton, for instance, is wedged between a couple of layers of volcanic ash that are about 3 and 3.2 million years old. And so her bones, or she was alive about 3.18 million years ago, because her bones were found closer to that 3.2 layer. So, so that's how we date these things. I think of it, when I talk to my students about it, I think of it as, shaking up a soda and pouring it really fast, and you get all that foam that slowly turns into the soda. And if you, pick up a soda and it has a lot of foam, it was just poured. If you pick up a soda with nothing on the top, then, and it's a flat soda, then it was poured a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can do sort of the same with what we find in these rocks.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So does that mean that the dating works better if fossils are buried because you have all these layers to compare to, as opposed to if they're peeking out somewhere and you don't exactly have a top layer and a bottom layer?
Yeah, the context is so important. So if you find a fossil just lying on the surface, it could have eroded out of something higher up. And so you run that risk. It's best to find fossils in situ, we call it. So in position. So you can identify exactly between which layers that fossil is eroding out of. If fossils are found on the surface, because often they are, or occasionally they are, I should say, you can find little bits of sediment still stuck to them that you then play a matching game of which sedimentary layer matches this chemically, geologically the best. And then work backwards to say, okay, therefore this fossil would have eroded out of that layer. So there's a lot of detective work that goes into identifying exactly what layers these fossils are eroding from. But ideally, and under certain circumstances with these fossils, we do find them in situ, found wedged between these layers, and we're able to date them with much more accuracy and certainty.
Is that dating process like a whole specialty of its own, or has it become relatively automated with advancements in computing and so on?
That's a good question. So it's not something I do, but it shows you that our science, we work with all sorts of different scientists with different backgrounds, and so trying to reconstruct the environment in which our ancestors were living. We have people who understand ecology very well, and paleoecology, and how the shapes of antelope bones are going to tell you about how forested an environment might be. We have people who work on the geochemistry of a fossil site, where they look at, again, the radioactivity of the feldspar crystals that they're pulling out of these tough layers of volcanic ash, and using mass spectrometers to figure out the ratio of radioactive to non-radioactive material. Again, it's not something I've ever done. I've stood in the presence of a mass spectrometer and I've seen it done. But yeah, it is pretty automated. And it's amazing now how we can get pretty good dates with less and less and less material. It used to take a lot more material. And now these, essentially better technology is allowing us to get high resolution results from less material, which is good. You always want to use less if you can.
That's a fantastic overview. Thank you. Okay, so going back to bipedalism, we have these two competing hypotheses of either we evolved bipedalism because it was advantageous or some way, or that was the original thing, and then chimps eventually evolved knuckle walking and lost the bipedalism. And it seems like there's a paradox either way, because if bipedalism was more advantageous, you would expect chimps to evolve that. And then if not, then the question is, why did they lose it?
Yeah, that's right. So historically in our field, we've been pretty comfortable with the idea of a knuckle walking ancestor. And one of the reasons for that is because genetically we're most closely related to chimpanzees and to bonobos, and those are knuckle walking apes. They climb trees very, very well, but when they're on the ground, they tuck their fingers and their wrists under their arms and they knuckle walk. And our second cousin is a gorilla, which also knuckle walks. And so if knuckle walking was not the body form from which bipedalism evolved, then knuckle walking would have had to evolve twice, once in the chimpanzee lineage and once in the gorilla lineage. And when things evolve multiple times, it's because there's a pretty good reason for it, ecologically. So, you know, streamlined body shapes in dolphins compared to sharks, right? That happen independently, and yet the body shapes are very similar. Think about wings in birds and bats and butterflies. It's the same kind of idea. So as a paleontologist, you know, I look at the fossils and I say, okay, you know, if we share a common ancestor that was a knuckle walker, as we go back in time to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 million-year-old fossils, we should find hints of knuckle walking in these bones, and we don't. Now, it could be that we haven't found the right fossils yet, and that could be the case. I'm open to that possibility. As a scientist, you have to change your mind with new evidence, right? And so if somebody puts in front of me a 9 million-year-old knuckle-walking ape from Africa, then that hypothesis is back on the table. But what we have for the fossil record in those old apes that were giving us a hint into the body form of the common ancestor of humans, chimps, and gorillas is something that's much more upright in the trees. It's not walking on two legs on the ground. We don't have evidence for that. Instead, it looks like it's moving on two legs up in the trees, almost like an orangutan will do, and gibbons do this sometimes as well. And so if that's the body form from which upright walking evolved, then what we're talking about here is not a new form of locomotion with upright walking. It's an old form of movement, just in a new environment. The environment would be the ground instead of up in the trees. And we have to still explain how those early ancestors didn't just go extinct, because moving on two legs on the ground makes you slow, vulnerable to predation, vulnerable to injury. And so there are these real negative side effects of moving on two legs on the ground, but it also is energetically efficient to move on two legs on the ground. We are the Priuses of the animal world. We don't burn much energy walking on two legs. We free our hands to carry things, babies and food potentially, and then we can share that food, and maybe that helps with a social group. And so there are these advantages as well that had to have outweighed the costs. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And so, you know, identifying what those advantages are has been a fun exercise in our science, and it's still ongoing. But then it raises the question of why knuckle walking in chimps and gorillas. And the explanation that some scholars have come up with, and again, we need fossils to test this, is that if you're a big ape and you climb up into a tree, having a long lower back, which we have, and we need it to pull our upper torso over our hips to stand upright. Having a long lower back is going to be a problem for a big ape in a tree because it can buckle as an animal is trying to bridge from one tree to another. And if you're a big ape in the tree and your back buckles and you fall, you're in big trouble. And natural selection is going to act fiercely against that by shortening and stiffening the lower back. You shorten and stiffen the lower back, and you now can't pull your torso over your hips anymore, and you're going to be hunched over. If you're hunched over, then you're going to bend your hips, bend your knees, lower your arms down, and those long arms to grab onto things in the trees, now you need to tuck them underneath your wrists and knuckle walk. So what are the ecological circumstances of knuckle walking evolving twice? Well, a big ape up in the trees. And that's what gorillas and chimps are. And so what we need to test this are more fossils of ancient gorillas and ancient chimpanzees. And they've been very, very difficult for our field to get.
And that makes a lot of sense. So going back to energy efficiency, I don't know if this was your group, but I've heard of a study involving taking chimps and humans and putting them on a treadmill and well, studying their energy costs, I guess.
That's right. This was not my group. This was research that was done by Herman Poncer at Duke and Dave Rakelin, who's at the University of Southern California. And they did this work while they were at Harvard, working with Dan Lieberman's lab. And again, the idea is about, how energetically efficient are we compared to our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. And so, right, they worked with Hollywood chimpanzees who had been trained to work with people and not tear their arms out of their sockets. And the chimps, they put the chimps on a treadmill, and they were able to affix a mask to their face that measured how much carbon dioxide output there was. So you're measuring how much energy they're using. It's sort of like the exhaust coming out of an exhaust system, right? And that's a proxy for energy use. And what they found was that chimpanzees use twice as much energy as humans do when they're walking. And it can be when they're walking on all fours, it can be when they're walking on two legs, it doesn't matter. The chimpanzees use a ton of energy. But because we walk with an extended leg, we use much less energy. And your listeners, can try this out for yourselves. If you try to walk around right now with your knees bent and just wobble around with your knees bent, it's not going to take long before your quads are absolutely burning and you're using all this energy to keep moving. And that's the situation the chimpanzee is in when it's walking on two legs. And so they use a ton of energy to do it. So extended legs end up saving energy. And so the hypothesis that arose from that was that now imagine early hominids moving around on two legs on an extended limb. They're not going to have to eat as much food. So if there's a circumstance where there's a drought or there's a time they can't get much food, those individuals moving on two legs, especially extended limbs, would survive better than the others. So maybe that's what initiated bipedal locomotion.
And it would be hard to test, but you would guess that if we're both trying to climb trees, the chimps would be much more efficient that way. So there's like a positive trade-off.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And look, humans today can climb trees. There are human populations that get up into trees reasonably well, but they climb a lot more slowly than chimpanzees do. And there's a danger to it. If you fall from that tree, big animals falling from trees, the bigger you are, the harder you fall. And that certainly is the case for humans and chimpanzees, but they've got longer arms, more acrobatic abilities in the trees with their fingers and their grasping feet. And so they're better equipped and better adapted for life in the trees, even than our ancient ancestors were.
So there's this classic problem with evolution, not like a problem like it doesn't work, but like a problem at figuring it out. A classic example is flying for birds is this massively advantageous trait, but it's like you have to evolve the wings first before you can get the benefits of flying. And I'm guessing you might have the same thing with bipedalism, because it's like once you evolve it fully and properly, maybe it's more efficient. But what happens in between where you kind of suck at both walking and flying?
That's right. And with birds, right, there's evidence that those feathers initially were being used for thermoregulation, to warm up the eggs. Maybe it was a gliding thing at some point in some lineages. And so those wings had to go through these transitional phases where they were not deleterious because they were being used for another function. And so with bipedalism, I think you're spot on that if you're this hunched over biped with bent hip, bent knees, wobbling around your environment, you're going to get picked off by leopards. There's no way that kind of body form is going to survive very well for very long. And so I don't think that thing ever existed. I think that you're going to find, as we go deep into the fossil record, And we do, the fossils we have all are hinting at something that is moving upright, but moving upright in the trees. And so if that is your precursor of being able to navigate in the trees in this upright style, then you never do go through some stage in which we are lousy bipeds. Instead, we kind of hit the ground running. As the trees begin to dissipate, as the grasslands expand, something that was upright in the trees with an extended leg to begin with now has co-opted that body form to navigate on the ground. Now, the early fossils we have also show grasping big toes. And so they're able to still climb very, very well to get away from predators and to get food and do the things you need to do to survive. But when they're walking on two legs on the ground, they're doing it probably in a more efficient way than an upright chimpanzee would do. We'll see, again, as we find more fossils. The fossils we have are tantalizingly hinting at this, but I think we need a lot more before I can say with great certainty that we didn't go through some chimpanzee-like knuckle walking phase. The great thing about our science, it's such a young science. We just this year in 2021 was the 100th anniversary of the very first fossil of an early human found on the African continent. It was found in the country of Zambia, June 21st, 2021, so 1921. So we only have 100 years of data of fossils from Africa. And the first half of that, we weren't really good at it yet. We weren't finding a lot. There were only a couple of teams out there finding a few things here and there. And now we're picking up the pace and we're beginning to find more and more and more and more. We're starting to figure out how to really find these things. And so it's a relatively young science, really just a couple of generations of researchers. And so, for your listeners, there's going to be a lot of exciting stuff that comes out in the coming years.
Great, I'm looking forward to it. So does your research actually involve field work where you're going out and digging fossils?
Yeah, so 2 years ago, before the pandemic, we were in Tanzania at a really famous footprint site called Liatoli. And Liatoli preserves the oldest definitive evidence of upright walking in our lineage. It's a fossil site that's 3.66 million years old. Preserves fossils from Lucy's species, the very famous Lucy. The species name is Australopithecus afarensis. And we worked looking for more fossil footprints. Footprints, I love fossil bones. I love the foot bones and leg bones, and working out the geometries of them and trying to figure out how the different shapes of these bones can be used to infer locomotion. How were they moving just based on the shapes of these ancient bones? But when they leave us footprints, there's no doubt, right, what they're doing. This is preserved behavior. And bones, bones are dead, right? There's something that has died. And footprints, you're getting a moment of life, right? Just capture this moment in time in the life of an individual who is still breathing and thinking and eating. And I don't know, footprints I find just haunting. I absolutely love them. And so this site of Liatoli is really special. And we made a great find when we were there in 2019, and it just got accepted for publication. So I can't say much about it now, but it'll be coming out in the coming months of just what we did find. But it'll be pretty consistent with the stuff we've been talking about, about bipedal evolution and bipedal variation. So that's a great site. And then I've done a little bit of work in South Africa as well. And in South Africa, it's a very different environment. These are cave sites where the fossils are preserved and recovered. And it presents very different kinds of challenges for recovery and analysis of the fossils.
So when you make findings, how do you know what you found? Like maybe you could find a bone and it's either a small finger or a big toe, or maybe it's something that looks suspiciously like a footprint, but it could just be a coincidence. Like,
Totally.
how do you answer questions like that?
Oh, geez, that's absolutely the case. Is that we find things that we puzzle over and scratch our heads over, and say, what in the world is this? And those are the things that are the most fun, right? The things that are real mysteries. But yeah, I mean, we need to know our anatomy, and so folks like me are trained in anatomy, so that when we pick up a fossil, the first question we ask is not what animal is this from, but what part of the body is it? Because a vertebra looks different than a leg bone, which looks different from a jaw, which looks different from a scapula, no matter the animal. So I was just teaching a couple of students in my lab, and I have a whale skeleton in my lab. And look, I study feet. What am I doing with a whale skeleton? Whales don't even have feet. But they're a great way to show, to teach about comparative anatomy. So a whale's shoulder blade, because they do have shoulders, is shaped almost exactly the same as yours and mine. It's just bigger, but it has the same parts. And so if you pick up a bone at a fossil site, it doesn't matter if it's from a zebra or an antelope or an elephant or a giraffe, you're going to be able to identify it as a vertebra or as a rib or a femur or a tibia or a big toe or a little finger, because they all have distinct shapes to them. Then the next question is, what animal is it from? So once you have the bone, you can say, oh, well, this bone is shaped in a particular way that would allow this animal to climb very well. Oh, okay, it might be a monkey. Or this is a shape that's going to allow us to move on 2 rather than 4 legs. Ah, it's an early human. Or something that moves on all 4s, you've got an antelope or a zebra or an elephant or something like that. So these old fossils, they don't come with labels, but we can use just sort of process of elimination to begin to figure out what animal group they belong to and what part of the body they're from. And then from there, you can really look at the tiny details to try to figure out what it is they're telling us about the life of that individual and about the long-term big picture evolutionary changes over time.
Uh-huh. And what's the cutoff point between like an abnormal individual versus maybe you've discovered a new species?
Geez, that is an ongoing challenge in our science. What you need are more fossils. You need to understand what is the normal range of variation within that population. So one of the things we can do is we can rely very heavily on variation within species today. So you can look at human skeletal variation around the world today, looking at collections of human skeletons of people, all over the world, and a lot of these come from medical schools where people have donated their bodies to science. That's the collection we happen to have at Dartmouth, and you can look at the range of variation and say, look, these are all upright walkers. These are all Homo sapiens. And yet you see a tremendous amount of variation. Then you can do the same in chimpanzees. You can do the same in baboons and get some quantification of what is normal variation in a species, right? And then you find a fossil. And you say, okay, well, is this similar to other fossils we've found and named? Does it fit within that variation? Does it have some of those unique features that define that species, even if parts of it are a little different, but different in ways that maybe wouldn't matter functionally? Or is this thing head to toe completely different from anything we've ever seen before in terms of its combination of anatomies? And then for me, what really matters is, do those anatomies matter functionally? Is this telling us about a different diet? Is this telling us about different ways of moving around the environment? And in that case, if you can build a strong case that this thing you found is filling a different niche, then maybe you can make the case that it's a different species. You can at least pitch it and see what your colleagues say. But ultimately, the way to really, really know about how to name these things is to be able to squeeze some DNA out of them and see what those genetic comparisons are to things living today, including humans, and to things living in the past. And look, when we do that, we can't do it with the millions of year-old fossils that I've been describing, but we have been able to do that with Neanderthal fossils. And what we've realized is that Neanderthals were not a separate species, that they were a population that then was absorbed into Homo sapiens as we met up with them in Eurasia. And we had babies with them, and we parented with them, and we absorbed their genome into ours. And so when I was in grad school, they were treated by most of our science as a separate species, and now we think of them a little differently.
So this is like the opposite of that linearity problem. We tend to add in more categories than there might actually be.
Yeah, that's right. So it's sort of this, pulsing machine where, as a science, we start off linear, and then we realize there's a lot more variation, and so the tree gets bushier, and then we realize we probably have oversplit the human family tree, and that these individual branches maybe curl together like more of a vine, in intertwining vine. And so all these different metaphors we're trying to come up with, what it just explains to me or shows to me is that evolution is complicated. And that any way that the human mind has come up with to try to simplify this this really complex and fascinating process, we're going to be oversimplifying it, and we're going to be thinking too categorical. And I think that it has hindered our process here. Having these categories, when you only have a couple of fossils, you can put labels on them, call them Australopithecus afarensis and Homo habilis and Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, and your family tree looks nice and clean. The more fossils you find, the more problematic it becomes, because you find the intermediates. And then what do you name them? Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you just say, well, this is an in between this one and that one, but people like labels. And so we end up calling it something new, when really, in terms of understanding the biology of what's happening, it wasn't a different species. It was showing you a form that was intermediate between this one and that one. But we like to put labels on things, and so we keep doing it.
Do you know of any examples of very different fossils that later turned out to be like part of the same species? I'm imagining if you found a fossil of like a 6'5" linebacker and a small child, I would think, no way are these the same species. And then, well, especially with children, or if you find young fossils, I bet you might run into that problem.
So kids are actually easy to identify because of their teeth and the thickness of the bones. And then if you find the ends of the bones, you can see the open growth plates, and you can tell that this thing was still growing. And so kid fossils can usually we can identify those with ease. But I hear you that the way I phrase it with my students is the Shaquille O'Neal, Danny DeVito problem. That if you've got those two skeletons, not only are they from the same species, they're from the same sex of the same species. Those are both adult males, and yet their skeletons would look very different from each other. So the question then would be, is it just size related? If we scaled down Shaquille O'Neal, would it look like a Danny DeVito's? Or scale up a Danny DeVito, would it look like a Shaquille O'Neal? And for the most part, the answer is yes. So if you just have size differences, you can control for size when you look at different shapes of fossils. And then you can say, okay, these are not different species. What we're seeing here is just different sizes. And in fact, that quite famously happened with Lucy species. When she was first discovered by Don Johanson in the 1970s, he was convinced he had multiple species. He was convinced he had 2 and maybe 3 species. And then a researcher by the name of Tim White, who's at the University of California, Berkeley, was able to show Johanson, or convince Johanson, I should say, after a lot of back and forth, that in fact what was at this site were different sized individuals with the same general shape to their bones, and that you had high dimorphism, big males and smaller females. That Lucy was a small female, and then you had these large males, and that was explaining this variation. And so, we've had these cases in our science before, and they very often have been explained through sexual dimorphism of males and females looking different from each other. Where that falls apart, though, is when you start to get into later Homo erectus and into Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, where we don't have as much dimorphism. The females are nearly the same size as males, compared to, say, a gorilla or a chimpanzee or an orangutan, where the dimorphism is much higher, or early humans, where the dimorphism is much higher. So I would say, I mean, to answer your question, I would say that the one that springs into mind for me, again, is Neanderthals. That when we have only looked at the bones of Neanderthals, the majority of the scientific community argued that they were a different species with no interbreeding whatsoever with Homo sapiens. And we were wrong. It took the genetics. There were quite a few paleoanthropologists saying that there was interbreeding on the basis of just the bones. Milford Walpole at the University of Michigan, most famously. But it took the genetics to convince the rest of the scientific community.
That makes sense. So looking at things as different species from a genetic standpoint, like I'm sure you've heard of ligers, like the lion tiger hybrids. So those are different species, right? Even though they can mate.
Oh yeah. I mean, but again, what I talk to my students about is that species is something humans have come up with to explain their world. And the living world doesn't care about our definitions. And so you're going to have these fuzzy boundaries. A mouse and an elephant are different species. So the species concept works at those extremes. But once you get to things that are very closely related to each other, the species definition starts to fall apart. And that's exactly what evolution would predict, right? Is that things that are more closely related to each other would be more likely to have not completed the speciation process, that there would still be some possibility of gene exchange in those very closely related things. Chimpanzees and bonobos are a great example. Chimpanzees and bonobos are our closest living relatives in the wild. They never interact because they're on opposite sides of the Congo River, so they don't meet each other in the wild. But in zoos, early, zoos didn't know the difference between a chimp and a bonobo. They would put them in cages together, and they could produce fertile offspring. Even though in the wild they never do. And so, I challenge my students. So are they different species? And the answer is both yes and no, because it depends on how you're defining it. And those are things living today that we can observe and study their DNA and study their skeletal anatomy and their behavior. When it comes to interpreting the human fossil record, we're so limited in what we can conclude about these different fossils in terms of whether they're different species or different regional variants of the same species. And so I try not to get too bogged down in it and look instead for patterns, right? What do we see over long periods of time that are happening in these lineages in terms of dietary changes, locomotor changes, cognitive changes, technological innovations that are happening? I think we as a science get a little too bogged down sometimes in what we call these things, and then we yell at each other at conferences about whether we call them the right thing or not. And I just don't find that intellectually too curious or interesting.
That makes sense. It does seem like over time, though, like consensus emerges, even if it takes like decades or maybe hundreds of years. Like, I guess when evolution was first proposed by Darwin, most scientists rejected it, right? And then suddenly now it's like major consensus.
Yeah, it took some time. I mean, I think there were a lot of enlightened thinkers in the mid to late 19th century who were primed to think about evolution, and what Darwin provided, of course, was the mechanism, right? He provided natural selection because people were talking about evolution. They were talking about change over time and species evolving. They just didn't know how it happened. And so, in science, you always want a mechanism. And what Darwin was able to provide was this really elegant mechanism, which then, when all of these scientists were able to apply that to their particular study subject, could see it unfolding before their eyes, whether it was paleontologically or even in behavioral studies, these sort of matches between an organism and its environment. But the real sort of linchpin to this was the incorporation of our understanding of genetics. And that didn't happen until the modern synthesis of the 1940s. And so really, you're right, that people were still struggling to understand evolution. The scientists were, through the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. And it wasn't until the synthesis of genetics and evolution by any means of natural selection happened into the 1950s, that then the scientific community was pretty universally won over. In terms of the mechanism of how this all happens. But now, we're revisiting a lot of those mechanisms and thinking a lot more about gene flow and about genetic drift. What
is that genetic?
Yeah. So the idea that sometimes change will happen simply because of the randomness of genetic change, and that if it doesn't kill you, if it's not deleterious, then it can survive in the population. And so we as scientists very often will be we'll look at some anatomy or we'll look at some morphology and we'll say, okay, why did that evolve? And we'll come up with some hypothesis that is selection based, that it helps your fitness, it helps your survival, it helps your locomotion, it helps your diet, it helps you in some way. And what a lot of my colleagues are now saying is that, I lost you for a second. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I still hear you. Just
okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think it was just a chord. What a lot of my colleagues are proposing now, and folks in biology have been talking about this for quite a while, is that maybe a lot of the anatomies that we see, a lot of the morphologies that we see, are things that evolved through drift, and that they weren't selectively advantageous. They just weren't disadvantageous. They just didn't kill you. And so, I struggle with that. I'm a Darwinian adaptionist. I think that most of what you see in the living world was favorable, at least at some point in our lineage, rather than not unfavorable. But it's fun to sort of think about those two different extremes, right? Of things evolved because of natural selection versus things are the way they are simply because they didn't kill you at some point.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Yeah. So it's somewhere in between those two extremes.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So in general, I guess the genetic variation tends to be random, but usually the selection mechanism isn't random. So if you look at it from a philosophical view, do you think there's sort of like an ideal, I guess it's almost like a platonic ideal of like any given animal, like hypothetically there's a maximum survival version, or do you think it's more just like it is what it is?
I love that question, especially thinking about human bipedalism, as I do. This is what I study, and I look out in the living world, and I see an ostrich, right, which has a foot and leg structure that's so different from mine, and yet it's a biped like I am, and it can run 45 miles an hour, which I can't. So is there an optimal biped out there? I'd say yes, and it's not me. It's not the human form. It's not a bipedal ape. It's a dinosaur, right? It's something that descended from a long lineage of theropod dinosaurs and goes back bipedal 250 million years, and has this extraordinarily optimized leg and musculoskeletal system of the lower limb that allows it to move its legs as quickly as it does. And that's simply not what I've inherited. And so there's sort of this big picture of optimization that you can think of it, almost like going back to what we talked about at the beginning, thinking about this from a physics standpoint, that if you were going to design a biped from scratch, what would it look like? And your engineers out there would design something that doesn't look like a human. It would look much more like an ostrich. And in fact, there's a robotics lab in Oregon that has a bipedal robot named Cassie. And Cassie is modeled after a cassowary. A cassowary is one of these large terrestrial birds that's found in New Guinea, kind of like an ostrich or a rhea or an emu. this was, they designed this based on sort of the principles of physics and mechanics of legged locomotion. This is what is going to maximize distance for the cost of energy. It doesn't look like us, and yet within the human lineage, what we see are all of these different forms of bipedalism that evolve at different times. And I've been fascinated by that, and whether there is some sort of optimal, given the constraints we have, that we are a bipedal ape that's going to have more muscles in its legs and feet because our predecessors were grasping with their feet, and that you work with the material that evolution has sort of given you. You can work with pre-existing materials. Is there some optimal within those constraints? And I would have said no. Over and over again, I would say absolutely not. What we're seeing here are forms that are just good enough to survive at the particular time and place they're living, and that there's no optimality. And we just worked on a paper this year that the results would suggest the opposite. That the human-like anatomy, the modern human-like anatomy that we see in Lucy and her kind, happened, and then that lineage would have gone extinct, and then it happened again in Homo erectus and into Homo sapiens. And so whenever you see things evolving twice, usually that's the work of selection. That this is the best solution to some ecological problem. And so I'm grappling with that right now. I'm struggling with having to change my mind over my ideas of optimality. And it could very well be that the modern human form, or at least, what we were 10,000 years ago, might be some idealized form if you're going to make an ape into a biped.
Uh-huh. Right. So you have these broad scale convergence like bipedalism, but then within the species, you're going to have different versions of whatever that ideal form might look like, or at least most optimal form given the constraints, like you said.
Yeah, within and between, because we do have different sort of forms of bipedalism throughout the human lineage, in things that we think are different species. And again, with the big caveat of the conversation we just had earlier about what is a species. But then, right, within humans today, there's tremendous variation in musculoskeletal anatomy, and part of that translates into different abilities and different performances. Usain Bolt was able to run. I mean, he can't do it anymore, but he would still beat most people in a race right today. That those long legs and that 6'4" frame, and then the musculoskeletal anatomy around his hip joint, allowing him to move the legs as quickly as he does. Not everyone is going to have anatomy exactly like that, but then you add to it a whole lot of training and good diet, and then a drive to be the best in the world, which not everyone's going to have. And you've got your Olympic gold medalist and world record holder, but some of that's anatomy.
So most of that evolution happens when we have these selection pressures for survival, and we don't seem to have that much anymore. So where does that leave us? Like it seems extreme to say we're devolving, but do you think that's happening?
Well, Dan Lieberman has written about this a little bit. He's got a book, The Story of the Human Body, where he talks about that. And it's an interesting concept. Look, some of the world is still subject to the selection pressures that our ancestors have been for centuries. I talk to my students a lot about third molar impaction, and how if you've got an impacted wisdom tooth, you just go to the dentist. Well, you go to the dentist if you have access to affordable dental care. Not everyone has that. And so impacted wisdom teeth can actually kill you if they get infected, and you can't just go to the dentist, as some of the world, if not much of the world, has that situation. And so there are places where I go to look for fossils where traveling on foot is dangerous because there are leopards, and leopards will still take down people. Crocodiles, same thing. And so, yeah, there, and now we're seeing it with pandemic, with being killed by viruses rather than leopards and lions. And okay, so we're still to some degree subject to natural selection, and yet I accept the premise that with 7.5 billion humans, many of which do have access to antibiotics and a lot of the westernized medicine that has saved so many lives, including mine. I wouldn't have lived past the age of 4 years old if it wasn't for antibiotics. And here I am, right? And now I've reproduced. So whatever genes would have, predisposed me not to survive in previous generations, they've been passed on. What that does, though, what I love about this is what it does is it increases variation. The more people there are, and the more mutations there are, and the more combinations of genes there are, the more variation there is. And so we can look at human variation today as sort of this model for all the different possibilities that could have existed in the past. And so one of the things that we've done is we've MRI'd a number of volunteers, and then we can digitally extract their foot bones, and we can measure how they walk. So they walk on a treadmill, they walk on a what we call a gait carpet, and then these people are still alive, but we can extract their bones from MRIs that they've taken, and we can ask the question of whether different shaped bones actually correlate with different gait patterns, and the answer is yes, they do. And then we can use that information to then interpret the fossil record. When we find a fossil that's shaped in that particular way, this might have been how they were using their feet. But that wouldn't be possible if everyone's feet were exactly the same, because natural selection had refined them to this narrow window, right?
Gotcha.
So this narrow window is opened up again, and we have all this variation that we can then use as a test for studying ancient remains. So as a scientist, I see variation in humans today as this wonderful pool of resources from which we can extract all sorts of really wonderful data.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That's a great place to close on.
Yeah, happy to do it. So we didn't. Yeah, I think we covered everything, right?
Yeah, Jeremy, thank you
Awesome.
very much for your time, and everyone, be sure to check out his book, First Steps. And if there's anything else you want to share, happy to help you plug it.
That's fantastic, Adam. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.